And I'm very pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Paul Sharp, who is a retired member of the University of Leeds School of Education. Paul is going to talk to us tonight about James Hole, the life and career of James Hole, and his interest in technical education. So I'd like to hand over now to Paul. It's not going to be illustrated, this talk. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'll make an immediate start. In 1954, when I was in primary school, the Thoresby Society published a monograph by John Harrison about the work of James Hole concerning social reform in Victorian Leeds. This study has stood the test of time, and Harrison's account remains an excellent source for Hole's contribution in a wide variety of areas, including the Mechanics Institute's movement in Yorkshire. This paper doesn't aim to revise Harrison's interpretations, but to build upon them and add a new dimension. Hole kept in close touch with the development of national policies for technical education, and at times was able to influence these policies himself. Harrison concluded that Hole's practical work in Leeds Mechanics Institute and in the Yorkshire Union of Mechanics Institutes was probably more important than that of any other single individual in the 20 years from 1847 to 1867. This was certainly true, and in addition, his interest in, and at times his impact upon national developments in this period should also be considered. At this early stage, I think it's necessary to note some general points which may seem strange from the perspective of the 21st century. Firstly, gender. The early Victorians saw both policy making and technical education as matters for males, not females. The sources for this talk have overwhelming male bias, reflecting how the Victorians approached these issues. To give just one illustration of this, the inauguration ceremony celebrating the setting up of the Yorkshire College of Science in Leeds was attended by 126 guests, consisting of 126 men and 0 women. Secondly, socioeconomic group. Those making policy were men with power, influence, and money. They discussed and made decisions about what could be done for working men, but they very rarely consulted working men to obtain their viewpoint. They regarded this as unnecessary and probably inappropriate. Thirdly, in the 19th century, the term technical education was used sparingly. In the early Victorian period, contemporaries normally spoke about art and design education on the one hand and science education on the other. From the mid-1870s to the end of the century, the term most frequently used was technical instruction. This talk will be mainly concerned with the 1850s, 1860s, and just moves very slightly into the 1870s, but not the later period. The first mention of James Hole at Leeds Mechanics Institute was in December 1845, and by January 1847, he had been elected to its committee. Soon afterwards, he became honorary secretary of the Yorkshire Union of Mechanics Institutes. Hull acknowledged that mechanics institutes had serious failings and they were not providing working men with the technical education they required. He argued that this was because the institutes lacked the funds to pay suitably qualified teachers, and he maintained that the state should provide institutes with some financial assistance for class teaching. In his view, this could not be left to the ordinary commercial principles of supply and demand. As he put it in his 1853 publication, the same principle cannot be applied to education as to loaves of bread or cotton gowns. This was because working people, having never received much technical education, if any at all, frequently could not appreciate its value. And moreover, at the same time, just could not afford the tuition fees that had to be charged. Hull also expected the wealthy, especially industrialists and employers, to give regular subscriptions to their local mechanics institutes. He stressed that government grants should aid and stimulate their local exertions and not supersede and paralyze them. In his view, they should always be partial. Before Hull arrived in Leeds, the possibility of making small state grants to mechanics institutes had been raised briefly in Parliament on at least two occasions, August 1836 and March 1841. But the governments in power had not been persuaded to take up the idea and nothing had been done. Hull was well aware that government grants were already given to the schools of design, and he argued that because of this, no new principle was involved in providing state aid for adult education in mechanics institutes. In his publications, Hull had a great deal to say about the schools of design, and it's important to understand why they came into existence and how they developed in the 1840s. So in the 1830s, there was a major campaign to give financial assistance to fine art and art education. This cause was taken up by William Ewart, the Radical MP for Liverpool, although when he put his question before Parliament, he stressed the need for assistance to art and design education and omitted fine art altogether. Ewart's main argument was that if Britain was to retain its supremacy in manufactures and commerce, it had to compete successfully with its European rivals. It was claimed that skilled artisans in France and Prussia were much more effective designers than those in this country because of the education in art and design they were receiving. Later, this argument was frequently used by Hull himself, and he maintained it was not only our superiority in danger, but our very existence. As early as 1836, the government accepted that something had to be done and agreed that the Board of Trade should set up and maintain a school of design in London. In September 1841, the annual grant for design education was considerably increased to enable the establishment of schools of design in large provincial towns. By the late 1840s, There were major concerns that the schools of design were not working well. There were conflicting views about the objectives of these schools. Aspects of fine art were taught in some of them, and there were classes for ladies who wished to develop art as a social accomplishment. It was felt that several towns with few industries requiring design education had been provided with schools of design. York and Newcastle were cited as examples of this. Overall, the needs of working people and manufacturers were still being neglected. Often working people didn't want to give up their evenings to attend classes, and many could not afford the relatively high fees charged. Manufacturers worried about the fact that their designs might be copied by competitors there, and they were certainly reluctant to give regular subscriptions. Towns with schools of design were expected to raise at least half the costs through subscriptions, donations, and fees. But to the frustration of politicians and Board of Trade officials, in practice, these were amounting to rather less than a third of the total. There was a further widespread problem. Students attending, often boys, frequently lacked basic drawing skills, and these had to be learnt before art and design relevant to manufactures could be attempted. There was no point in trying to do advanced work with students still lacking elementary drawing skills. James Hole had little time for the government's School of Design scheme. He pointed out that in 1843, the Mechanics Institutes at Leeds and Liverpool had applied for government aid to their own already existing drawing schools. This had been refused on the grounds that the schools of design were intended to be separate, independent institutions and should not be linked to mechanics institutes. Hole believed that duplicating institutions was an evil, dividing the funds and talents available locally. You finished up with two or more feeble institutions rather than one vigorous, flourishing one. There is no evidence to support this proportion, but Hole claimed that mechanics institutes would have achieved the same objectives of the schools of design with half of the funding. By the late 1840s, ministers and officials at the Board of Trade were well aware of the shortcomings of the schools of design, and Henry Cole was asked to make suggestions for improvements. Cole was a civil servant much in favour during this period. With Prince Albert's friendship and support, he was largely responsible for organising the Great Exhibition of 1851, which turned out to be such a great triumph. Cole wrote critical reports about the schools of design, which concluded that the scheme had inherent defects, including its constitution and management. He advocated a complete change of system. When Cole encountered opposition, he resigned and refused his fee. However, from outside government, he launched a vigorous, concerted campaign against the schools of design. Controversy ensued, which I won't go into, but in 1852, the government set up a new Department of Practical Art with Cole as its full-time head. His brief was to develop a brand new scheme. When James Hole wrote his essay on mechanics institutes he was completely aware that drastic changes were being made, but he could not be sure how they would turn out. It's probably fair to say at this point, Henry Cole had probably not come to firm conclusions about this himself. The ideas being developed in 1852, 1853 were particularly interesting both nationally and locally. In Cole's new scheme, the term School of Design was replaced by School of Art. Cole knew that Cole recognised that the previous scheme for art education had failed to provide adequate instruction in elementary drawing techniques. Cole's scheme proposed aid for such instruction for adults, but Cole worried because he remained unsure whether this instruction would take place in new specialist schools of art or whether it could be provided in schools of art situated within mechanics institutes. He argued very strongly that mechanics institutes should be given state assistance to provide drawing classes for artisans as long as they complied with the government regulations then in force. Cole's worries were possibly alleviated quite soon. In 1852, Cole visited Bradford on behalf of the Society of Arts to promote provision for art education there. On arrival, and very much to his surprise, he was informed that the Bradford Mechanics Institute already had drawing classes for artisans. At a public meeting, Cole indicated that there was no wish to damage or supersede the Mechanics Institute's drawing classes, but a will to work with them and develop them. A few months later, the Westminster Mechanics Institute opened a drawing school, and at its opening ceremony, attended by the president of the Board of Trade, Cole extolled the value of having drawing classes in mechanics institutes. His speech was duly published by the new Department of Practical Art. Mechanics institutes were clearly being included in Cole's new scheme and were going to be eligible to receive state aid. Cole called for the provincial schools of art to be managed by local committees and not by a board in London. He claimed that the latter would lead to endless bureaucracy and to large salaries for the administrators. The arrangements Cole proposed would, of course, be necessary if the Mechanics Institutes were to play a major role in the new scheme. These ideas fitted well with Cole's own plans. Cole was determined that in all cases, localities would have to approach the state for assistance and would have to guarantee to provide premises, furnishings, heating, and lighting. The local committees, not the state, would employ the teachers, appointing them and paying them. They would have to put on evening classes for artisans, charging only moderate fees as prescribed by the department. Cole and Cole were at one concerning these issues. It was Cole's strong view that if mechanics institutes were to extend and improve art and design education, it was essential that they had properly qualified and properly paid teachers. With regard to the provision of properly qualified teachers, in 1852, the normal School of Design was moved from Somerset to Marlborough House, and renamed the Central Training School. As the name implies, its main function was to train teachers for local arts schools. Certificates were awarded to trainees as and when they passed different courses. The average number of certificates held by a qualified art teacher was fractionally over 2. Teachers who had qualified at the central school were supplied to provincial schools of art, but appointed by the local committees. Thus, Cole's scheme ensured that the teachers in the schools of art were properly qualified. Moving on to the payment of teachers, Cole proposed, and here I quote word for word, an annual grant might be given to all institutions willing to give a certain prescribed class of instruction. The amount might be contingent on the number of pupils actually receiving instruction and able to pass a satisfactory examination. Make it dependent upon the result, and then no interference would be required with management, for provided the effect desired takes place, the how is of secondary consequence. This was a very early proposal for payments on results, and it was not taken up immediately. In 1853, each certificate awarded to teachers during the period of training received a payment of £10 per annum. And these payments on certificates remain the most important element in the state financing of art education in the period 1853 to 1863. Meanwhile, from 1856, Cole experimented with partial payment on results to teachers given instruction in drawing in elementary schools. Cole was pleased with how this worked and regarded it as the first introduction of payment of results into the state system of education. Later, and controversially in 1863, the whole system of payment on certificates in schools of art was withdrawn and replaced by payment on results. By this time, Cole and the influential politician Robert Lowe, now vice president of the Committee of Council on Education, were convinced of the virtues of payment on results and wanted to extend them as widely as possible. There's no evidence to suggest that Cole played any part in this extension to the whole of art education, but he was the person who proposed payment on results in principle 10 years earlier. An issue on which Cole and Cole took different views in the 1850s was whether art classes for artisans could be self-supporting. Self-support was much discussed and implied that the fees paid by the artisans, together with subscriptions and donations from manufacturers, could cover the total cost of instruction without financial assistance from the state. Cole argued that although this seemed reasonable enough in theory, it would not work in practice. He maintained that many artisans could not afford to pay sufficiently high fees, and those who could were unwilling to do so because they didn't appreciate yet the true value of art and design education. Cole always favoured partial aid from the state, but he believed strongly that no state support would result in practice in no art education for artisans. Cole too believed that education could not entirely rely on supply and demand. In his own words, education is not like bread and cheese. Some state assistance was justified initially, but it should not become a permanent means of support, according to Cole. Cole frequently asserted that the provisions for art instruction should become self-supporting as soon as practical. On many occasions in the 1850s and early 1860s, Cole implied that this could and should happen quickly. Later, Cole changed his view and urged his political masters to increase state grants to technical education. However, in these early years, Cole's faith in progress and his optimism concerning self-support contrasted with Hull's more cautious, realistic, practical approach. Hull took special interest in the School of Art established within the Leeds Mechanics Institute. He maintained that there was plenty of activity in art instruction in the Leeds area, with hundreds of children taught drawing in elementary schools. On the other hand, Hull regretted that there was still insufficient application of drawing skills in industry in Leeds. Hull and the headmaster of the School of Art feared that the school was not making much impact upon the artisans in the town because so few attended the evening classes available. They believed this was because the classes were insufficiently practical, failing to meet the needs of the workmen. The school was essentially a drawing school without specialist classes linked to the practical skills required by particular trades. Hull pointed out that the accommodation currently available was not suitable for such practical classes. He argued that Leeds Mechanics Institute needed a larger, better building which incorporated specialist rooms for the School of Art. Eventually, a large sum of money was raised and such a building was put in place, opening in 1868. This building still stands and now houses the Leeds City Museum. However, Cole didn't witness the benefit as he left Leeds in 1867 before the new building was opened. Now, leaving art and turning to science education, quickly, a couple of national changes to explain the context. To the surprise and I think displeasure of Henry Cole, early in 1853, his political masters added science to practical art to form a new science and art department. In 1856, this department was transferred from the Board of Trade to the Committee of the Privy Council on Education. Both the Education Department, which dealt with the education of children, and the Science and Art Department were controlled politically through this committee, but they continued to operate completely separately. The head of the science division from 1853 was Lyon Playfair, a Scottish research chemist and university academic, who incidentally later in the 1880s became the Liberal MP for South Leeds. The early science schemes in the 1850s failed without doubt, with very few science classes in existence. The contrast between the science and art divisions could not have been greater, with science teachers and art teachers finding themselves in very different positions. Art teachers could make a living wage by combining income from the evening teaching of artisans, teaching children art in local elementary schools, and probably the most lucrative of all, teaching middle-class women in daytime classes. The latter wanted to learn art as a social accomplishment and were prepared to pay the high fees which covered the full costs of their courses. On the other hand, science teachers could not, except in very rare cases, obtain sufficient income from daytime work for which there was no market demand, and had to rely entirely on income from evening classes for artisans. The latter just did not provide a living wage. The result, in 1858, there were only 3 science schools in the whole of England, none in Yorkshire. At this point, Playfair left the Science and Art Department to take up a chair at Edinburgh University. Pole had always regarded the provision of scientific instruction for working people as the main purpose of mechanics institutes, but this had failed. By 1859, it was clear that the Science and Art Department had also failed in its attempts to do this. In March of that year, wrote to the department on behalf of Leeds Mechanics Institute. He argued that the department itself should set up and conduct examinations in science. Such examinations, he believed, would provide a stimulus to students and would command public confidence. The Lord President of the Committee of Council, Lord Salisbury, took personal interest in this letter. Salisbury had already organised some scientific instruction for his workmen at Hatfield House. He instructed Henry Cole to write to Hull to obtain more details about the needs of Leeds. A lengthy correspondence ensued. Hull told the department that it should originate and for some time liberally aid science schools. He continued that every large town ought to have a science school in which might be acquired a knowledge of chemistry, mechanics, natural philosophy, and applied mathematics. In his view, the science education available in Leeds was insufficient for its industrial population. He was dissatisfied that in a large town like Leeds, where processes such as dyeing and tanning were conducted on a large scale, there was only one class with about 15 students devoted to the study of chemistry. Hull stressed the cost of efficient instruction was more than the working classes were able or willing to pay for. He proposed 1, qualified science teachers should be provided and there should be assistance towards paying them. 2, help should be given with the purchase of books and apparatus. 3, there should be a means of testing and rewarding pupils who prove their proficiency. Salisbury and Cole had several long discussions about the future of science education. Over dinner on the 31st of March, 1859, Salisbury told Cole that unless a scheme was developed to make science common wherever the public wanted it, he would abolish the name. This statement made considerable impact upon Cole. He related it to the Select Committee on Science Instruction in 1868 and also included it in his memoirs. Salisbury received no support from Charles Atterley, his vice president. Adderley told Salisbury and Cole that he didn't believe a new scheme had much chance of success, and he wanted to drop the whole idea. However, Salisbury persisted, and Hull was informed that the department intended to consider what aid could be granted, but he was warned that in no circumstances would the department originate science schools. In all cases, the initiative would have to come from the public in the localities. Sir James K. Shuttleworth, the former secretary to the Committee of Council on Education, was consulted. He spoke about what had been done by the East Lancashire Union of Mechanics Institutes to promote science education in the Burnley district, and he approved the proposals for a new scheme. Finally, at the beginning of June, after a 4-hour discussion, Salisbury and Cole persuaded Adderley that a new scheme should at least be given a try. Later, in 1859, the department implemented new arrangements for the training of science teachers and introduced a new scheme for science students. The latter was a complex, cumbersome scheme involving payments on certificates, payments on students' results in annual examinations, and payments to science schools for students who won prizes for excellent results in their exams. I shall not go into detail concerning this scheme because it was short-lived. Robert Lowe replaced Adderley as vice president of the council, and he was much more favourably disposed to payment on results than Adderley. Lowe and Cole worked closely in partnership to develop a scheme of aid to schools and teachers based entirely on students' results in examinations. This was implemented in 1862. You will recall that in his 1853 essay, Hull had suggested payments to teachers should be made according to students' examination results. This was now to happen in practice. The 1860s saw massive expansion in the science division of the department. Although Lowe has often been associated with reduced expenditure in education, this was certainly not the case concerning science education in the 1860s. Only 6 science subjects qualified for aid in 1859, but this number was increased to 17 in 1862 and to 23 in 1865, where it stayed with little change for the rest of the 19th century. This was hardly conducive to reducing expenditure. Numbers of science teachers increased from single figures in 1859 to 123 in 1865 and to 746 in 1869-70. A survey of 1871 found no fewer than 815 of the 867 science teachers had other employment in addition to their science teaching, and 556 of them worked in day schools. Many science teachers were, in fact, elementary school teachers in the day, supplementing their income by teaching evening science classes. Without doubt, some elementary school teachers recruited able formal pupils now in employment to attend their evening classes. The Select Committee on Scientific Instruction reported that over 9,000 students were receiving science instruction in England in 1868. A survey of science examinations in the whole of the United Kingdom in May 1870 found there were 16,000 individual candidates working 34,000 papers. 770 papers were submitted by students under 11 and nearly 7,000 by students aged between 11 and 14. And of course, in 1870, most of those between 11 and 14 would have been young workers. Hull's approach to the department in 1859 had led directly to these dramatic changes in the provisions for science instruction. There was no doubt that the Mechanics Institutes shared fully in these developments. In 1867, James Hull left Leeds for London to become the secretary to the Association of the Chambers of Commerce, but he retained his interest in technical education. In the same year, the United Kingdom fared very badly in the International Paris exhibition, which Lion Playfair attributed to this country's poor facilities for technical education compared with those on the continent. He led a vigorous campaign demanding greater state aid for technical education. Henry Cole was completely persuaded, contending that national urgency required national action. Towards the end of 1867, Hull visited Cole at South Kensington and told him that the country needed more technical instruction and that he, Cole, was the man to deliver it. Cole asked Hull to approach the Lord President of the Committee of Council and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and give them this message. However, nothing happened, and in 1868 there was a change of government. The Liberals were elected with Gladstone as Prime Minister and Lowe as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Both favoured retrenchment in public expenditure. Although two strong supporters of the Yorkshire Union of Mechanics Institutes, the Marquis of Ripon and W.E. Forster, the MP for Bradford, became Lord and Vice President of the Committee of Council on Education, respectively. They were unable to obtain state funding for new developments in technical education. Lowe made it very clear to Forster that the planned Elementary Education Act imposed considerable additional demands on the country's finances, and this made increased expenditure on new developments in science education out of the question. A little aside here, Lowe and Forster could not stand each other, and that battle had been a long one with a lot of vituperation. But the expansionists, including Playfair, Cole, Hull and Forster, didn't win this battle. The country had to wait many years for further change. Meanwhile, Playfair's campaign for more science education made impact in Yorkshire. When James Hull left Leeds, his administrative role at the Yorkshire Union was taken on by Henry Stales, who was directed to survey provisions for science education throughout the county. His report showed considerable deficiencies, and he identified a want of properly trained and qualified science teachers as at the core of this. Of course, this was something Hull had argued for years. Soon after the publication of Sales' report, the Yorkshire Union approached the Yorkshire Board of Education to explore how more science classes could be initiated in the county. The Yorkshire Board of Education was a voluntary association of the great and the good. Its president was Lord Frederick Cavendish, MP for the West Riding and a member of the Royal Commission on Scientific Instruction and the Advancement of Science, which was chaired by his father, the Duke of Devonshire. The Yorkshire Board of Education was short-lived. It existed for just over 7 years, but it made considerable impact. It worked closely with the Yorkshire Union, with Henry Sales acting as the visiting agent for the Union and honorary secretary of the board. In 1867 and 8, conferences for elementary schoolmasters were organised in Yorkshire's major towns and cities. These conferences led to the setting up of well-attended science classes for schoolmasters on Saturdays. Once these teachers passed their own science department examinations, they were able to become part-time science teachers under the department themselves. They could offer their own classes and earn payment on results to supplement their incomes. It was estimated that in 2 years, about 100 schoolmasters in Yorkshire qualified as science teachers in this way. The results were quite spectacular. In 1868, in Yorkshire, there were 14 science classes with just over 400 students. By 1872, 4 years later, the Union reported 95 classes with approaching 3,500 students. I don't want to overclaim for James Hole and the Yorkshire Union. They could advocate major changes and often did so, but they couldn't get practical action on their own. They needed the support of influential national figures. Hole was very much aware of this, and he worked hard to obtain such support. I'm moving on fairly fast now because I am conscious of the time. We know that Hole wanted to get the support of influential people to support his ideas. He, of course, didn't know his letter to Lord Salisbury on this subject would be taken seriously, but it was. Salisbury, of course, was the head of a family with huge political influence in Victoria and England. He was the father of one prime minister and the great uncle of another. He was just the person to take forward Hole's ideas. Salisbury instructed Cole to consult Hole, and there is no doubt that Hole's views on science instruction had considerable influence on the national system developed in the following years. Hole's letter of March 1859 was certainly the catalyst. And we can also say that Hole and the Mechanics' Institute movement were lucky to get, or fortunate to get, the support of Lord Frederick Cavendish and the Duke of Devonshire. And it was their efforts to train elementary schoolmasters as part-time science teachers which led to the spectacular expansion of science classes in Yorkshire in very short time. But the support of those with large landed estates was not inevitably to guarantee success. They had the support of the Marquis of Ripon in the early 1870s, but this wasn't enough because even more powerful people within that government, that Liberal government of 1868 to 74, were against increasing public finance further. And Lowe as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Gladstone as Prime Minister remained against it. Payment on results proved to be a key element in the state financing of evening science and art classes from the early 1860s until they were finally abolished in 1897. Cole had advocated them, as you remember, as early as 1853, and was one of the first people to do so. The philosopher and economist John Stuart Mill wrote in favour of payments on results. He argued that state aid to education was justified because it was one of the great goods which merited departure from laissez-faire, and that payment on results was the best principle to apply to the remuneration of teachers of all classes and grades. Samuel Smiles adopted a similar attitude. In the 1860s and early 1870s, payment on results were widely regarded as ingenious, progressive, and highly successful. James Hall was one of the first to come out in favour of this approach. But in the 1860s and early 70s, there was some opposition to payment on results. Some argued that they led to cramming and rote learning with no practical work. The Yorkshire science teachers complained that they put huge effort into teaching weak students but received no payment for these students if they failed their exams. These criticisms were mooted in the 1860s and early 70s, but this changed dramatically in the 1880s and 90s. Negative aspects of payment on results were stressed, and there were concerted campaigns for their abolition. The Science and Art Department, which assisted mainly adults, clung on longer to payment on results than the Education Department, which was dealing with children. The reluctance of civil servants in the Science and Art Department to abandon payment on results brought it into disrepute with charges of perpetuating reactionary practices. And only in the late 1890s were they finally replaced by payments on attendance. Briefly, what can we conclude about Hole and the Yorkshire Union of Mechanics Institutes? Hole's analysis that the Mechanics Institutes were failing to provide technical education for working people, and the main reason for this was lack of funds to pay teachers, was essentially correct. His belief that only state aid could rectify this situation was also a strong argument. In addition, the pragmatic Hole realised that force of argument was insufficient to bring about change. He was fully aware that it was necessary to have people with influence, power and money on his side to achieve his aims. And he worked hard with the Yorkshire Union to make sure this was the case. He was largely successful, with the result being that the Mechanics Institutes in Yorkshire were able to use Science and Art Department payments to provide science and art classes from the 1860s to the end of the 19th century. By the 1890s, local authorities had been given powers and funding to expand and transform adult technical education, and mechanics institutes were no longer major players in the national system. However, throughout the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, Hole and the Yorkshire Union had ensured that mechanics institutes were able to supply evening science and art classes for working people. usually young working men who wanted them. It was likely that these young men used these classes to establish themselves as keen, committed, skilled workers in their trades. Sorry if I've run over time a little.
That's no problem, Paul. Thank you very much for that interesting talk. Can I throw open to the floor now? Does anybody have any comments or thoughts or questions that they'd like to put to Paul? You can unmute yourselves, and nothing. There's nothing
Hello.
in the.
Hello.
Yeah, who's talking
Hello.
now?
Hello.
Nicholas. Yep.
Yes.
Hello.
No. I'm speaking. I'm retired. I retired this year. I was keeper of library and archives at the Science Museum, and we have in our archives a very interesting archive of evidence that was presented to the Royal Commission on Technical Instruction, which took its evidence in the South Kensington Museum in the 1880s. This is slightly later than the period for this talk. But within that archive, there is actually an item by James Hull, and it's the prize essay on literary, scientific and mechanics institutions by James Hull, which was a Society of Arts prize essay.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about this particular copy of this prize essay is that it was given directly by the author to G.R. Redgrave, Gilbert Redgrave, who was the secretary of the RCTI. So he had enduring influence, if I may say, although you'd have to read the full published report to see whether that was included within the Royal Commission's findings. But I just thought I would add that as an interesting aside. And also within the archive, there's a very interesting volume of press cuttings relating to the teacher's visit to the 1867 Paris Exposition. It's not just press cuttings, but there's also some manuscript reports in there as well about the concern about the French technical education, and of course this was a great concern that led to the RCTI being set up. But the Science and Art Department was also placed in South Kensington, next to the South Kensington Museum, and also there were a series of exhibitions there that were held in response to that concern about French technical education, or technical instruction, as they called it then.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And we've had a comment in the chat. Somebody saying it's interesting that mechanics institutes were regarded as the provision of technical education to facilitate competitiveness of industry rather than the universities. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Remember that the number of universities at that time were quite limited, and they weren't that interested in technical education at that point. It did improve later.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
Yes, I've got a couple of questions. Kevin Grady here. First of all, we talk about the teaching of drawing both in elementary schools and obviously in the Mechanics Institute. I mean, what sort of drawing were they actually taught? What were they receiving in these evening classes? And the other thing is, how does this compare with the provision of technical education in Germany and France at the time?
I can only give an honest answer to this. I don't know the answer to, I think, either of your questions. I got interested in this because I was interested in how the state became involved in this question. And people have said to me before, quite rightly, that you're not an expert on art education or science education, and I am not. So I'm sure people could be found who could compare both internationally and also give you a much better answer than I could about what the drawing skills were like, when what was strong about them and what they lacked.
Yes, I mean, you sort of have the notions of, I mean, my father used to teach technical drawing at a college of further education and maths subsequently, but you have this notion of people there with their set squares and their pieces of paper and drawing boards, that sort of thing. It'd be interesting to know in detail, and also to what extent, the manufacturers of Leeds, sort of reflected in their own companies and factories the use of the skills that were learned at these classes.
I couldn't agree with you more about that. It needs further research, I'm sure. And I mean, it's the same with the science. Some industrialists, I mean, probably the most famous is Lord Armstrong from the Northeast with his armaments manufacture and his shipbuilding. He had no time for what was going on in technical classes, and said it was far too vague and was, put it in modern terms, a waste of time.
Right. There's a bit of comment here on the chat about why employers weren't prepared to support their workers financially on this. So some of them did, of course, and some didn't, depending on what was in it. What was in it for them? Carolyn Huston says.
It's a fair comment. Some were persuaded that these activities were useful, and some thought, well, there's going to be a clear expense to this if I'm giving money out and I'm not sure I shall get a reasonable return.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, he was interested in all sorts of stuff, though, Paul, wasn't he? I mean, when he moved down to London, he became very interested in getting common land open for the masses, and he was also interested in these village libraries, wasn't he? He set up over 200
yes.
libraries in Yorkshire. I think they were in Yorkshire.
That's right. That's certainly true, Chris. The range of his interests were, I want to say, unbelievably broad. I mean, John Harrison, in the thing that the Thoresby Society published in 1954, goes across a very wide range of stuff that he was involved in. And I think we know much less about him when he gets down to London, but clearly he does pursue various strands of his interests there as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Well, it looks to me
Hello
that,
again. This is Nick
yeah.
Wyatt again.
Yeah.
Can I just say that there was a question about visiting, if anyone visited technical schools abroad. And in 1879, a group of 5 students from the Bradford Technical School visited weaving schools in France and Germany, and their report is in the archive I mentioned already.
Yes. I mean, the people that were involved in the Samuelson Commission report, nearly all of the members of that committee at their own expense went onto the continent to look at what the technical school facilities were. It is amazing that this was being done in the 1880s.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that seems to be all the questions.
Okay.
So just remains for me to thank you, Paul, very much for your talk, and to remind people of the next talk. It's a busy month next month for the Society. We've got our lunchtime talks, which you can see on the screen now. The next evening lecture is on the 21st by Tony Harkup, and that's on the Leeds Other Paper Remembered, alternative news and views between 1974 to 1994. So there we are. I will close the meeting on that basis, and look forward to seeing you, as many of you as possible, next month.